In a small room filled with quiet murmurs and bowed heads, a simple prayer begins. Lord, grant us wisdom and discernment, the speaker says, his voice firm yet humble. Around him stand officers, leaders, and citizens, united in a moment of faith. He prays not just for safety, but for fairness, for decisions made with compassion, not power. Protect the freedoms you've given us, he continues. Bless the people who serve and the citizens they protect. As the Amen echoes through the room, no one could know that this prayer would soon stand in sharp contrast to the nation's actions. A nation divided by faith, politics, and morality. Moments later, a question cuts through the calm. Can a person truly call themselves pro-life if they defend the mistreatment of others? That single question sets the tone for the conflict that follows. Across America, voices rise, clashing over what it really means to protect life, not just in the womb, but in every stage of existence. In recent years, scenes of pastors and priests being dragged away by ICE officers have shocked the world. Peaceful protesters, men and women of the cloth, have stood against immigration policies they see as cruel and unchristian. Even the Pope himself has spoken, challenging world leaders for turning away from the gospel's call to mercy. He reminds them that faith without compassion is hypocrisy. Someone who says, I'm against abortion, but supports the death penalty, he argues, is not truly pro-life. Someone who claims to defend life, yet accepts inhumane treatment of immigrants, that is not pro-life. These words resonate far beyond church walls. They raise a painful truth. Morality cannot be divided by politics. Each issue, abortion, immigration, justice, demands the same standard of respect for human dignity. The Pope calls for something rare in modern times: mutual respect. He urges Americans, especially Catholics, to look at all ethical issues through the lens of Christ's teachings, not through the rhetoric of power or nationalism. Across the United States, a new wave of Christian nationalism is taking shape, blurring the line between faith and politics. But not everyone is silent about it. The first American-born Pope, Pope Leo from Chicago, has stepped into the conversation with a clear and courageous voice, speaking directly to bishops and social workers at the U.S.-Mexico border. He denounces the cruelty shown toward migrants. He calls these policies the opposite of Christian teaching, acts rooted not in faith, but in fear and control. Letters flood his office, letters from families torn apart, from mothers separated from children, from those who have seen loved ones detained and humiliated. Their stories are heartbreaking. In one video, a mother is ripped from her teenage daughter and newborn baby as ICE officers restrain her on the street. Neighbors rush to help, but they're pushed aside. The daughter screams, her voice drowned out by sirens and shouting. She's thrown to the ground as her mother disappears into a van. For believers watching, the message is unmistakable. This is not what Christ would do. Pope Leo's response is direct. He calls on U.S. bishops to speak boldly, to defend those who cannot defend themselves. His message is simple. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. To him, the Church's role is not to serve political power, but to stand with the powerless. and his courage is beginning to stir the conscience of many who have stayed quiet too long. Meanwhile, some of America's most visible political figures, many of whom identify as devout Catholics, are being confronted by their own contradictions. Tom Homan, a vocal defender of Trump's border policies, calls himself a Catholic. Yet the leader of his own church has declared those very policies unchristian. Carolyn Leavitt, another Catholic politician, opens her press, conferences with prayer, then spreads falsehoods about immigrants and refugees. Marco Rubio and Kristi Noem do the same, invoking God's name before defending cruelty. Kristi Noem even released a video showing herself praying with ICE officers before immigration raids. Moments later, those same officers storm homes and detain families. The footage of their prayers is followed by the cries of children, a jarring reminder of the gap between words and actions. And that's precisely why Pope Leo's voice matters. Without it, these leaders might continue to use faith as a weapon rather than a witness. But this debate runs deeper than politics. It strikes at the heart of America's founding values. The separation of church and state wasn't meant to erase faith from public life. It was designed to protect it from corruption. As the narrator explains, our founders didn't get everything right, but they got religion right. They understood that government should never elevate one faith above another, nor interfere in a person's private beliefs. The freedom to worship or not to worship was central to the American experiment. It was meant to safeguard both the church and the state from each other's excesses. Today, however, that delicate balance is under threat. The rise of Christian nationalism, particularly within movements like Project 2025, challenges the very idea of that separation. Its leaders claim to fight for faith, but their goals appear more political than spiritual. They use the language of religion to push ideology, not morality. They speak of Christian values, yet ignore the core of Christ's message. Love your neighbor, show mercy, defend the poor, and welcome the stranger. Pope Leo sees this clearly. He warns that when religion becomes a tool of politics, both the church and the government lose their soul. Faith becomes performance, and prayer becomes propaganda. He calls believers to return to the gospel's essence, to compassion, humility, and truth, even when it challenges national pride. Because true Christianity, he reminds the faithful, cannot coexist with hatred or oppression. In one particularly powerful scene, chaos erupts. Protesters, priests, nuns, and lay people stand peacefully outside a detention center, praying for the families held inside. Suddenly, officers rush out. Without warning, they fire chemical agents, pushing the crowd to the ground. Among them is a priest who later recalls the attack in harrowing detail. They shot me in the head, face, and torso, he says. Others shielded me, taking the blows meant for me. Still blinded by gas, he remembers being dragged away as street medics rushed to help. They shoved us into a corner. Nowhere to run, he says. They brandished weapons while we prayed. The video evidence confirms his story. Officers advancing, protesters crying out in prayer, and clouds of gas filling the air. These are not scenes of defiance, but of devotion. Ordinary people of faith standing against inhumanity and paying the price for it. Through it all, the Pope's message remains unwavering. He calls for moral clarity, not partisan loyalty. He asks believers to examine their hearts and actions. If you claim to follow Christ, he says, then show it in how you treat the least among you. His challenge extends beyond politics. It's a test of conscience for anyone who calls themselves Christian. As the video concludes, the narrator's tone softens. Everyone, he says, has the right to their faith. But when that faith is used to justify harm, others have the right to speak out. The line between private belief and public action is sacred and dangerous when crossed. The American founders understood that religion thrives when it is free, not when it rules. They knew that political power could corrupt even the holiest intentions. And Pope Leo, standing at the crossroads of faith and politics, echoes that truth for a new generation. The closing images return to that opening prayer. The officers, the bowed heads, the quiet request for wisdom. The words still sound sincere, but now they carry a new weight. Wisdom isn't found in authority or enforcement. It's found in compassion, in the courage to see humanity even in those we're told to fear. The story ends where it began, with a call to remember what faith truly means. It's not about defending ideologies or nations, but about living with integrity and mercy. The Pope's warning cuts through the noise. You cannot claim to follow Christ while turning away from those he loves. To be pro-life is to defend all life, the unborn, the imprisoned, the immigrant, and the poor. Anything less is not faith, but contradiction. And as the music fades, the words linger like a challenge. If faith is truly alive, it must be seen not in words, but in deeds. Because faith that forgets compassion is no faith at all. As the dust settles from the chaos at the protest site, the sound of sirens fades, replaced by the hum of distant voices praying quietly. The camera lingers on the faces of those who stood their ground, people of faith who didn't come to fight, but to remind the world of what it means to be human. Their clothes are stained with tear gas and sweat, their eyes red and burning, yet their expressions remain calm, almost peaceful. One woman, clutching a small wooden cross, whispers, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." In that single sentence lies the entire heart of this conflict, a clash not between believers and unbelievers, but between two versions of belief itself. Pope Leo watches these events unfold from across the ocean, but his concern reaches far beyond the borders of any one nation. For him, what's at stake is not just policy, but the soul of Christianity in the modern world. He sees how politics has twisted religion into a weapon, how compassion is dismissed as weakness and mercy as compromise. In speech after speech, he calls this what it is, a moral crisis. The Church, he says, cannot be silent when cruelty wears the mask of faith. We must not let the name of Christ be used to justify what he would never approve. His words find support among some bishops, but resistance from others who fear political backlash. Still, the Pope's conviction grows stronger. He reminds them that the gospel does not belong to any political party, it belongs to humanity. You cannot pray with one hand and strike with the other, he warns. To defend life is to defend all life. The unborn, the immigrant, the condemned, and the poor. For many Catholics in America, this message feels like a wake-up call. Some realize they've allowed nationalism to take priority over the cross. Others double down, accusing the Pope of interfering in politics. Yet, as the footage of raids and detentions spreads online, the contrast between his words and the reality on the ground becomes impossible to ignore. Mothers in handcuffs, children crying, priests thrown to the pavement. This is not the America that claimed to stand for life and liberty. And Pope Leo, steady and unflinching, keeps asking the same question: is this what Christ would do? Meanwhile, political leaders continue to defend their actions behind a veil of faith. Press conferences begin with prayers. Policy meetings open with verses from Scripture. Yet the outcomes, broken families, deported workers, and dehumanizing rhetoric, reveal the emptiness behind the words. When confronted, these leaders insist that faith guides their decisions. But faith, as Pope Leo often reminds the faithful, cannot be genuine if it serves the powerful instead of the powerless. At one rally, a crowd of supporters chant slogans about faith and freedom. A local reporter asks a simple question: how do you reconcile your pro-life beliefs with the treatment of migrants? The speaker hesitates, shifts, and repeats the same rehearsed line. We are protecting our borders, but protecting borders is not the same as protecting people. Faith, real faith, cannot be measured by how high we build our walls, but by how wide we open our hearts. This moment reveals something deeper, a struggle within the American soul itself. The founders built the idea of freedom around the right to worship and to dissent. They believed that religion should inspire morality, not manipulate power. Yet as political movements begin to use the name of Christ to justify fear, that balance begins to crack. The more faith becomes tied to identity and party lines, the more it loses its essence, love. Pope Leo's speeches travel across continents, sparking both admiration and outrage. In them, he doesn't only speak to politicians, but to every person of faith struggling to understand their place in a divided world. If your faith does not make you more compassionate, he says, then it is not faith, it is ideology. He reminds believers that Jesus himself lived as a refugee, fled persecution, and preached mercy to those society rejected. If Christ were among you today, he asks, would he stand at the border with a gun, or would he walk among the children behind the fence? His words pierce deeply. Some politicians dismiss them as rhetoric. Others twist them to suit their agenda. But among ordinary people, mothers, teachers, police officers, and priests, they awaken something powerful, a recognition that being pro-life cannot stop at birth, that protecting the sanctity of life means defending the poor, the oppressed, and even those who break the law. For to dehumanize one is to dishonor all. In interviews, Pope Leo often returns to the same message. Faith and reason must walk together. Compassion and justice must hold hands. He explains that when believers let anger or pride dictate their morality, they turn faith into ideology. True Christianity, he says, is not about defending institutions, but about defending people. It is not about winning debates, but about living truth. If the church loses compassion, he warns, then it loses Christ. But compassion has its cost. Those who speak out are not always welcomed. Pastors who preach mercy find their churches divided. Nuns who shelter migrants face government threats. Even ordinary citizens who question the morality of certain laws are labeled unpatriotic. Yet, amid all this, something remarkable begins to happen. Communities, once silent, begin to pray together across differences. Catholics, Protestants, and people of other faiths join hands at vigils, not to protest politics, but to plead for humanity. At one such vigil, a young man stands before a crowd holding a candle. He says he once believed faith was about rules, who was right, who was wrong, who was saved, who was not, but now he believes it's about relationship. I used to pray for my own safety, he says. Now I pray for theirs, for the people our laws forget. His words echo through the crowd, blending with the flickering light of hundreds of candles, a symbol of faith reclaimed from fear. As the night deepens, Pope Leo's message plays on screens and speakers across the gathering. Love is not weakness, he says, his voice calm and steady. It is strength. It is the courage to see the face of Christ in every person, even in those you disagree with. The crowd grows silent. For a moment, all the noise of politics disappears, replaced by something older, purer, and far more powerful, the quiet conviction that compassion is the truest form of faith. The video fades to black, but the message remains. The challenge is simple. Will faith continue to divide, or will it finally heal? Will religion serve power or people? The answer, Pope Leo reminds us, is written not in laws, but in love. The night after the vigil, the world feels quieter. But beneath that calm, a storm of conscience is beginning to stir. Across cities and towns, people start to question what they've accepted as normal. The images of officers praying before raids, of mothers in handcuffs, of children crying for their parents, refuse to fade. For many, faith has become an uncomfortable mirror, showing not just who they are, but what they've ignored. In the days that follow, reporters gather outside churches, eager to hear how religious leaders will respond. Some priests choose silence, hoping the controversy will pass. Others step forward, speaking softly but clearly about what they've seen. One of them, Father Daniel, stands before his congregation and says, "If defending the law means abandoning love, then what law are we really upholding?" His sermon spreads online, drawing praise and backlash alike. Within a week, he receives threats, not from strangers, but from people he once prayed beside. Meanwhile, Pope Leo continues his mission. From Rome, he delivers a series of addresses that ripple across the Catholic world. His message is steady, firm, and filled with compassion. You cannot follow Christ halfway, he says. If your faith only comforts you, but never challenges you, it is not faith, it is convenience. His tone is not one of anger, but sorrow, the sorrow of a shepherd watching his flock wander toward division. He speaks of unity, but not the false kind built on silence or fear. True unity, he insists, comes from truth, from standing up for the dignity of every human being, regardless of race, nationality, or status. And that truth, he warns, often comes at a price. In America, that price is already being paid. Videos surface showing peaceful worshipers pushed to the ground during protests. Priests are detained for standing beside migrants. Volunteers at church shelters are investigated for aiding illegal activity. Yet for every act of suppression, the movement grows stronger. What began as isolated acts of compassion becomes a collective cry for justice. At a small parish near the southern border, Sister Angela leads a prayer service for detained families. The walls of the church are lined with children's drawings, hearts, homes, crosses, and angels. During the service, she reads a letter from a mother separated from her son. The woman writes, "They took him from my arms, but I still pray every night for those who took him. May God soften their hearts." The congregation weeps silently. There are no political speeches, no slogans, only prayer, raw and real. Pope Leo later refers to that letter in one of his homilies. When the innocent suffer, he says, heaven listens, but it also watches. It watches those who remain silent. His voice, though gentle, carries an unmistakable challenge. To be a Christian, he reminds his listeners, is not to be comfortable in faith, but courageous in it. Political figures, meanwhile, begin to feel the weight of his words. Some defend themselves, insisting their actions are rooted in security, not cruelty. But the Pope's message leaves little room for justification. A border is not a barrier to compassion, he says. Every nation has the right to protect its people, but no nation has the right to forget that all people belong to God. The statement makes global headlines. It's quoted in newspapers, debated on talk shows, and dissected across social media. Some accuse the Pope of meddling in politics, others call it prophetic truth. But beyond the noise, ordinary citizens begin to reflect. Teachers discuss it in classrooms. Pastors reference it in sermons. Even police officers, like those who once prayed before raids, start asking harder questions about what faith demands of them. One officer, speaking anonymously, tells a journalist, "I used to think faith meant following orders. Now I think it means protecting what's right, even when it's not easy." His words capture the quiet transformation, spreading across the nation a shift from obedience to conscience. But transformation rarely comes without resistance. In Washington, faith-based organizations aligned with political movements push back hard against the Pope's statements. They accuse him of misunderstanding American values, of undermining patriotism. A senator even calls him a foreign figure interfering in domestic affairs. The irony, of course, is not lost on anyone that the head of the world's largest Christian church is being criticized for preaching the very values Christianity teaches. Pope Leo doesn't respond directly. Instead, he addresses the faithful in general terms. When truth offends power, he says, it reveals where power's heart truly lies. He reminds his listeners that Christ himself faced opposition for speaking truth to authority. They called him a troublemaker too, he says softly. But he troubled the world so that the world might find peace. His words echo like a challenge to those in power and a comfort to those struggling to stand firm. Because in every age, there are moments when faith and politics collide, and believers must decide whom they truly serve. Back at the border, the tension grows heavier. New footage shows ICE officers advancing on another group of demonstrators, priests, mothers, and young activists singing hymns as they hold candles. Without warning, tear gas fills the air. The camera shakes as people run for cover. Amid the chaos, a priest falls to the ground, clutching his rosary. Others rush to help, using shirts and towels to cover his wounds. Later, he recounts the moment with quiet clarity. I felt the sting of the gas, the blows, the fear, he says. But I also felt peace, because I knew I was standing on the side of love. The clip spreads rapidly online. For many, it becomes a symbol of faith under fire, not in foreign lands, but in the prize, heart of America. The image of a priest lying wounded, still holding his rosary, becomes both an indictment and an invitation. An indictment of hypocrisy and an invitation to rediscover what faith truly means. As outrage grows, so does reflection. Commentators begin to ask deeper questions. Has religion in America become more about identity than morality? Have Christians forgotten that love of neighbor is not optional but essential? Pope Leo's words begin to sound less political and more prophetic. He isn't attacking a country, he's reminding it of its soul. In one of his final addresses of the season, he speaks directly to those torn between faith and fear. Do not let politics steal your compassion, he pleads. If your nation forgets mercy, remind it. If your leaders forget humility, show it. The future of faith does not depend on who rules the land, but on how the faithful love within it. Those words echo across cathedrals, churches, and living rooms. They reach those who once cheered for power but now long for peace. And perhaps most importantly, they remind the world that faith at its core is not a banner to wave, but a light to carry quietly, humbly, and fearlessly.